penetrating and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to, remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's teaching.
In Zen Buddhism, when Zen practitioners share their understandings of the teachings and practice, it is offered as a practice of dana paramita. Dana is a Pali word that means generosity or to give freely, and this is done without the expectation of anything in return when the opportunity arises. And those who practice it or share their teachings at Great Tree do so on a dana basis. So you can support their practice by going to the Great Tree website and donate. Yes. And our speaker today is Rev Teijo Munnich. Teijo is a disciple and Dharma heir of Rev Dainin Katagiri. She studied with him from 1975 until his death in 1990, receiving formal training at Hokyoji in Minnesota, Tassajara Zen Mountain Center in California, and Hosshinji Sodo in Obama, Japan. Reverend Munnich was ordained as a Zen priest in 1981, and in 1983 she began to envision a practice centered in community, which is a residential practice for women. And this came to be Great Tree, incorporated in 2004. And after, I guess, 21 years, she will be installed formally as the abbess in a mountain seat ceremony this September. Thank you, Teijo.
So, we're studying, we're in our study group, we're studying the Mountains and Waters Sutra, written by Dogen Zenji, from the commentaries that have been put into a book by Shohaku Okamura. And I guess that probably the reason that I wanted to study this book at this time, although I've been wanting to do this for a while, is because because of a comment that was made by Cohen Franz when he gave a talk about the mountain seat ceremony, and he said that the first when you begin in ordained, you go to the mountain. Go to the monastery. All the monasteries seem to be built in mountains. I was told once that the reason that Japanese monasteries are built at the foot of the mountains and temples is because nobody else wants to live there because the mountains are crumbling all the time. But somehow these monasteries have been there for hundreds of years, so it doesn't seem to have affected them. But so then after the training in the monastery, then the ordained person, the nun or the monk, leaves the mountain, and I say, and goes out into the marketplace. So it's kind of Zen is different in that respect. You have a period of training, and then you don't always, in Thich Nhat Hanh's tradition, the monks and nuns are required to live in a monastery their whole life. But it's different in Zen, in Japanese Zen, and I don't know what Chinese. But anyway, so then after you've been out of the marketplace for a while, kind of taking the practice that you awakened to in the monastery and trying to apply it in everyday life, then at some point you might end up becoming head of a monastery or a temple, and that at that point you're returning to the mountain, but according to Koan, you are becoming the mountain. And when he said that, let me see if I can turn off my texts. I don't know if that'll help. Mm, thank you. Um, so when he said that during his talk, and I just said it very simply, but if you heard his talk, he led up to it. It was a whole talk, and then at the point where you go up the mountain the second time, you become the mountain. And I remember him saying, I said that was what Shinzanshiki was. That's what the mountain seat ceremony was about. And I just had a kind of my body kind of said, oh my gosh. Yeah. Because the idea for me, the mention of becoming the mountain was a very powerful message. And it affected me very much in the moment. And I thought, wow, that would be great. That would be great. But then I realized that it's up to me. So it's not a matter of just going through the ceremony. It's a matter of returning to that practice, the practice in the way that I experienced it in the monastery. But the monastery had structure for me. It was all one of the things I heard before I went to Japan was that all you had to do was keep the schedule. And I thought, far out, that's going to be so great. Because in Minnesota, I wore many hats. I was like Genjo. At 1 minute I was the Ino, 1 minute I was the Tenzo, 1 minute I was the person cleaning the temple. So many things had to be done. And although many people came to Katagiri Roshi's lectures, few stayed for work period. So the temple didn't get cleaned unless those of us who had been trained in the monastery were there. Somehow that was what we learned how to do in the monastery. But of course, it wasn't just about cleaning. It wasn't just about the work that was being done, taking care of the monastery, but it was the whole thing. It was the practice of meditation. It was the working together and taking care of the temple, taking care of each other. One of the jobs was to fire up the fire to heat the bath. That was a job. One of the jobs was to wind the clocks, wind all the clocks. And the challenge when you've got wind up clocks is to get them so that they all ring at the same time, because they don't keep the time in the same way. I don't know how to describe it. But so there were many, many aspects to the practice. So there was that, Togen Zenji emphasizes practicing together, studying together, and working together. And those were the three components. But there was no wiggle room. If you got sick for more than 3 days, you had to go somewhere else and get well. Or you had to just push through it. And in some senses, it's maddening. Because I don't want to do that right now. I want to do what I want to do. And so there were those moments when you realized that you either had to do it or leave. You either had to follow the schedule or you were out. And what it does is it squeezes you, in a certain way. You don't have those choices, and you don't have any choices. On the other hand, you're taken care of, you're fed. All you have to do is just move with the group. And then there's the group. You don't always like everyone. In the convent where I was at, one of the superiors used to tell the young novices that were coming in, she says, she told them, you better be here for the right reasons, because in 10 years, when you're walking down the hallway, you're only going to like about 10% of the people. You know, it's hard to live with other people, and it's hard to appreciate differences in other people. So anyway, there's lots of things that squeeze you in the monastery. And when you're out in the marketplace, you give yourself a little bit of flexibility to the point where you start to kind of do things in the way you want them done. You know, and sometimes, you know, you're drawing from that experience, and sometimes I put myself into situations, of course, where, you know, the Zen Center of Asheville, we had Zazen 6 mornings a week, 5 evenings a week. So, you know, and I gave lectures every week, and so, you know, there was some structure there. There's been a lot of structure here at Great Tree in the past, particularly. Since COVID, I've kind of relaxed a bit, a lot. But we've had many residents here. We've kept schedules where we only had 1 day off a week, and, you know, so that kind of squeeze. So what does that mean for me now? Now my body is getting older, and I can't do the practice in the same way. Even like Sesshin, I'm trying to figure out a way to not have my hip hurt. I'm missing some cartilage in my hip, and there's arthritis in there, so there's this burning, and I'm very attached to the full lotus position, and so it's challenging for me, because if I let it penetrate down to my knees, then I'm going to have knee problems, you know. So there's these challenges with practice. What does it mean now? And of course, this is always the challenge. What does it mean for me at this stage in my life? What does it mean for me on this day? So that was what attracted me to this. How do I become the mountain? And I do believe that when we do this practice, when we really put ourselves into this practice, and so Sesshin is a sort of a mini way of doing that. You know, it's a mini monastery experience. When we put ourselves into the practice, then we become one with the practice. You know, in the what's the name of that? What's the name of that book where I write Dancing with Dharma? What's the name of the book? It's a book that several of us women teachers put together, realizing that there wasn't much commentary on Dogen's writings by women. And so we all, remember the name of it? Receiving the Mirror, yeah. So what I wrote about was a book called Fascicle of the Shobogenzo. We each could choose a fascicle that we wanted to write about. So I wrote about the Bendo Wa, which is something that I've studied a lot. I worked on the translation of with Shohaku at his temple in Japan, and so I thought, well, you know, this is a good one for me, because I looked at this a lot. And when it came to the part of describing what samadhi was, I went back to an experience that I actually had when I was studying dance, which is first, you know, like this was a particular dance class that I'm thinking about when my teacher, and it was all levels, you know, so she was creating this dance for just whoever showed up for that class. So there were the people who were in the company, and then there were some of us who had studied a lot but weren't in the company, and some who were just new, and so there were all these different levels. And she first she taught us the movement across the floor. Then we started to get the steps, you know, first you get the, you know, just the how you move, and then you get more detailed about the steps. Then you start to feel the movement of the group. And it was all very nice, but it was exhausting because we were putting a lot of energy into this. So we kind of got across the room and we were starting to get really tired. And we said, we got it. Quit. And she was like, no, do it again. And so she said, class isn't over yet. Do it again. And we did it again. And again, we said, okay, we did it again. Now can we stop? And she was like, we got 3 more minutes. Do it again. And it finally got to the point where I heard her say in the distance, okay, you can stop now. And I felt like I wasn't doing anything anymore. My body was just being moved by something else. So that was my first experience of samadhi. And it was before I actually started studying Zen, started studying with Katagiri Roshi. But that's the same experience that we have when we're sitting on the cushion. We're sitting there, and then we're like, why am I even doing this? This is so stupid. There's so many things that I have to get done in my life, all that kind of stuff. Or I'm feeling so agitated. This is not a good time for me to be sitting. And of course, those are the best times. Because those are the times when we really, there's something there that we need to let go. So that thing has pushed us to the point, some fear or some attachment, something that we really are afraid to look squarely at. And at that moment, if we stay, we notice what it is. We notice the delusion that we're trying to keep alive, the story that we're trying to tell ourselves so that we don't have to touch that thing which will initially bring us some pain. Because when you touch those fears initially, you feel the burn. But then when you see it, it starts to dissipate. And I had a lot of experiences like this when I was at the monastery. I would be just lingering in some anger and not even realizing that I was lingering there. And then suddenly notice what I was doing. And then all there is the energy. And that's really, that's the thing that it kind of, my students at the college used to call it getting into the flow. But Zazen, gets us into that flow. And, they used to ask me, well, if I can get into the flow without doing meditation, why do I have to do meditation? And I'd say, yeah, I know you can get into the flow, but do you know how you got there? And really, we don't know how we get there. But how we get there is when we have that moment of recognition that allows us, or not just allows us, puts us into that place of the flow, what is called the flow, or of just letting go of that thing that we weren't recognizing and we're running from. One of the conclusions that I've kind of come to in reading, and we've only finished chapter 1 because we're going section by section. There's a lot in each section of each chapter. Is that really what becoming a mountain is letting go. And I keep coming back to this thing of letting go because it's an interesting experience to try and understand and create. And I had an experience when we were writing, I think it was for the 3rd book, we ended up writing 2 more books after this, just a chapter each. When we were writing for the 3rd book, it was decided that the book was going to be about the Eightfold Path. And so I just piped right in and said, I'll do right effort because that's the one that's always been the most interesting to me. And I was writing a lot of stuff. I was talking about right effort, and I was writing about right effort, and I had lots of really, interesting ideas that I was talking about. But then I couldn't bring it all together. And what had happened during the course of the year or so that I was trying to write this chapter, my aunt, whom I was pretty close to, was dying. She was in hospice. She was 96 when she went into hospice, and we thought she would die at any minute, but then she lasted for another year, and so that kind of interrupted my thinking about right effort. And I spent the last week of her life with her. And if you've ever spent a week or some period of time with someone who is dying, it's a very confusing experience, because you can't do anything. You can't do much. You want to do something, but you can't do too much, because you can't really keep this person from dying. And you're not dying, so you don't really know what they're experiencing. So in that way, it's hard to help. But yet, I wanted to be there with her. Somehow I wanted to be there with her. And there were some things that, I was able to do, saying rosaries and things like that. And getting the choir in to sing for her, and kind of facilitating the hospice and things like that. But a lot of the time it was very kind of unclear. But anyway, so that was a real powerful experience. It really death puts you into the experience of impermanence, and in general. So I continued to work on this after she died, and after the funeral, after he came back, and for about a month or so, I got pneumonia, so I was in bed. So I had time to kind of process things, but I kept trying to pull this together, and I kept missing deadlines. And then I started to realize at a certain point, just about a month before the last final deadline, that I needed to let go of something in order to write this. But even when you have to let go of something, you don't know what it is you have to let go of. And so for about a month, I was trying to figure out how to bring it together. And someone offered me a space, and I just went to that space and I printed everything up, and I had just piles of stuff I'd written, and sorted it all out. And finally, there was this nagging thing that was going on for me, that somehow I needed to deal with my aunt's death. And I had actually gone to therapy to try and figure out how to do this. But there's not very many people who do therapy who know how to do grief stuff. So, while it was helpful, it wasn't really doing it. And so finally, one day I just said, this is just nagging me. Maybe I just need to take this whole pile of stuff and set it aside and write about my experience of grief. And then maybe I'll be able to pull this all together. But as it turned out, that was what I needed to let go of, was something about that. And I wrote that, and that ended up to be my chapter. And it wasn't very polished. We didn't have AI in those days, so I couldn't polish that. But it just flowed right out of me. And I just sent that in. That ended up being the chapter. But it was so this whole experience of letting go was something I recognized at that point that I needed to do, and knew that I couldn't do it. And that's a very difficult experience, to know that there is something that needs to happen, and you don't know how to make it happen. So then I was thinking about this also in relation to a talk I had to give in was it 2022, 2023, out at that big Jukai ceremony that happened on 22, out in LA. There were 5 of us that had to give talks, and we could talk about anything we wanted, which was kind of interesting. And what we decided to talk about, and we didn't have to all, follow a theme or anything, but we decided we wanted to, about the paramitas. So we each could choose a paramita, and before I had a chance to choose diligence or effort, somebody else chose it. So I chose a paramita of the precepts, Shila. And I thought, well, which is interesting because we were also studying the precepts from the perspective of Dogen. Shohaku Okumura and Reb Anderson were giving talks about Dogen's writings about the precepts. And we were all, and it was a big precept ceremony, something that's not done too often, every, I think 15 years or something like that. I was at the last one, but it was all in Japanese, so I didn't quite know exactly what was going on, but this time we did, the whole thing was done in English, it had been translated. And so anyway, there I was, so I was trying to prepare for this talk, and it was the same sort of thing. I mean, everybody talks about the precepts. We've talked about the precepts. What can you say about the precepts that hasn't been said? And how is it a paramita? Like, paramita to me means practice. Paramita is usually translated as perfection, but it's a verb. It could be perfecting, the perfection of, like dana is one of the paramitas. It's the perfection of giving, really. So I was trying to figure that out, and what I realized is, again, it's about letting go. Keep practicing the precepts is about letting go of old habits, letting go of the inclination to do something when it's just a habit, when we notice it. I often mention the Dalai Lama in his description about karma. He talks about how if we are angry and we act from that anger, and then we say, oh, I shouldn't have acted, that's good, because we're backing off of that engagement with that anger. And maybe we do that again and again. We act and then we say, oh, shouldn't have done that. And then maybe at some point down the line, we might notice it before we act. We might say, oh, kind of backing up from it. And the precepts really point to backing off of our karmic habits. But we have to let go of something in our mind that tells us we need to act on that, or we need to, that it's okay, and that it's not harmful. We need to recognize the harm to the point where we we can let go of it, or it lets go. This phrase that Dogen uses, Shinjin Datsuraku. It means dropping off body and mind. And when you first encounter it, of course, you say, oh, that's what I have to do. I have to drop off body and mind. What does that mean? And we start to ask, what does that mean? And it means, to not be caught by what our mind is saying, what our body mind is telling us to do. Because our body participates in this activity. It's not just a mind. Our mind is not separate from our body. So then at some point, Dogen turns that around, though, and he says, body and mind dropping away. So it's not our activity. It's the result of our effort. And, I always say this phrase that I know I'm paraphrasing it, but that's something that Katagiri Roshi said in one of his talks on Bend Alive, right? He said, we live by our effort, but not only by our effort. We are supported by all beings. And so, effort is a funny thing, because when we put an effort in, even into something like practice, then we can become kind of obsessed with it. And so, because we like the feeling that we get. And so then we make it into something. But before we do that, just to experience the experience, and then not try to do more to get that feeling again. That's what we do when we have an experience. And I had this was very graphic for me one time when I had an experience of becoming one with the shoji screen in the monastery, which sounds silly, but it was really a profound experience for me. I suddenly had the recognition. And the shoji screen for me, I sat right in front of the shoji screen, and I was pretty close in the monastery because I was on one of the side tons. So I didn't have that distance that the monks had. And so I was, and it just I thought, this is so boring to look at. Why do I have to look at this very boring thing? Everybody know what a shoji screen is? It's those screens that, have they're grids. It's the Japanese screens. I've got them in my room. But they are windows. The windows in Zendo were made of these grids, these shoji screens. And then finally, somewhere along the line, it was during a sesshin, I was noticing the shoji screen, and I realized that I said to the shoji screen in my mind, you and I are the same thing. And I really felt it with my whole being. And I thought, the experience of interdependence. That's what it really was. So then I spent the next 2 days trying to do it again. Finally realizing that, you can't wake up in the same way twice. Once you're awake that day, So so that kind of experience that, we have from our effort. And I was, during the sessions, I would make a great effort, but then when you have an experience like that, it's like, oh, I see what I need to do, and you keep trying to make that same thing happen. So again, it's this letting go. It's this Datsuraku Shinjin that happens from our effort. And we don't know. I used to always notice at Minnesota Zen Center, right after I was ordained, and I was going to sessions every month prior to that for 5 years. And then right after I got ordained, Roshi gave me the position of the job of, what would you call it? Guiding the servers. It was called Soku. We called it Soku. And it was the person who told the servers when to go in, and just kind of, and also sometimes the Soku would join in the serving if it was necessary. And I noticed, you know, they always talk about the third day of Shin being the day when you really start to let go. Because I say it's because you're just too tired to hold on to all that thinking that you've been doing the first 2 days. But I would always notice on about the third day that things would just kind of flow. Even if something went wrong, you know, it was just my state of mind was such that I just didn't worry so much about things. And that's when they start to just kind of flow. And so I noticed it 3 or 4 times during session, and I thought, I need to try and pinpoint when that happens. The moment when that shift happens, so that I know how to make that happen. Which, as you can see, just from listening to me, is a delusion that we can do that, you know. But this has been one of my challenges for my whole practice, is finding that moment when you shift from being engaged in the relative and are just flowing in the absolute. You know? And of course, I came to the conclusion after many, many efforts that it's impossible to find that point, because that is the point of letting go. And so we live by our effort. Our effort brings us to that place. And Shohaku would say we live by our desire. It brings us to that place, that moment of recognition of what it is that we need to let go of. When we say, oh, I'm thinking too much, or I'm angry, or I'm worrying too much. We notice it, you know, and that's all we have to do. There's a tendency in Zazen to kind of say, oh, I'm thinking too much. I have to do something about this. And we miss that moment. We don't see that moment. We don't see that moment anyway. But we immediately re-engage rather than just allowing that moment to becoming that moment, becoming that mountain. So this is what I realized that I need to do, and in this chapter, which I haven't even gotten around to yet, maybe I'll give another talk tomorrow. Come back at the same time. I'll talk about what I was going to talk about, which is this chapter called Mountains and Waters Are Dwelling Places for Sages. And Dogen even takes you to the place where, you know, we are all the mountain. The sages, the Buddhas of the past, and the Bodhisattvas of the past, and the ancestors, all of the ancestors, Dogen Zenji says, they are the mountain. When they went to the mountain, they didn't leave any trace. But just like birds know the pathway to migrate, even though it's not visible, even though it's not concrete, they know the way because of what's been done before. When we enter the mountain, the path is there, but there's no footsteps. And when I was reading that, I was thinking about how well, yeah, no traces, no footsteps, but what about all these writings? You know, Dogen wrote all this stuff. But then I thought, well, really, when you read Dogen, and Shohaku refers to this in the first chapter of this book, you can't try to understand Dogen. It's, what did he call it? Not understanding. What was his translation? Was it not understanding? Yeah, I mean, that was like a term, not understanding, is we have to do not understand. You know, and we've been kind of grappling with that in this study group, you know, about how when we read these chapters, even what Shohaku is saying, Shohaku really gets into that same, you know, and you kind of go, Shohaku, do you know what you're talking about here? And then when you read it like 5 or 6 times, you start to say, okay, do not understand it, you know? And that's really becoming the mountain. And then he says, we are always all in the mountain. We are always there. And what we have to do is awaken to that. Awaken to that. And then we can follow the no traces of the ancestors and the sages. So that's basically what that's it in a nutshell, but you got to read the chapter. It's really, letting go. So what I'm realizing, and I realized it even before we started reading this, before I started looking at this chapter, is that there are so many things in our lives every day that if we notice these habits, these karmic habits, if we notice them, we can begin to say, oh, I see what I'm doing here, and kind of back off a little, like what the Dalai Lama is talking about. It may take many times, many noticings. I often tell the story about one time we had a sesshin in Minnesota it started 2 or 3 days after Christmas and it went through New Year's. It was a 7-day sesshin, and that was our Rohatsu sesshin. Rohatsu is usually done at the beginning of December, but somehow before I got there, someone had probably told Roshi that that's not a time when people can come, and that, like for students, they have a break, and for people at work, they might be able to take time off. Anyhow, that's when we had our seshins. And so every year I would be at that sesshin, and one time I noticed that my mind was criticizing everyone as they walked into the room, finding something wrong with everybody that was walking into the room. And I thought, oh, wow, that's something to notice, And so I don't know if I kept aware of that, throughout the year or not, but I did notice at the next sesshin, at the next year at that same time, that I was still doing it. And I thought, wow, I'm still doing it. Maybe I need to work on this a little bit. And so I tried to find ways to work on it, and then I sort of forgot about it. I see you like I am. And the next year I noticed that I was still doing it. And, but I don't know how many years it took, but finally, one time I noticed at the same sesshin, I wasn't doing it. And I thought, what happened? I think that, it takes a long time to kind of unpack these things. It's not just we notice about one thing, but all the things that created that particular way of thinking or that particular way of behaving. There's not just one thing that causes a karmic habit. It gets reinforced in so many ways. So if we want to undo certain karmic habits that we've been doing since we were 5 or 6 years old, maybe, it takes a little bit of time. It takes a little bit of time on the cushion. And as I say, I was doing seshins every month at that time. And so probably there was some unpacking that was going on during those seshins. And I was going to meditation every day. So, these things are not quick to happen, but these letting go, I think, is a process. So we notice we're thinking in a certain way. We notice we're speaking in a certain way. And we say, oh, I don't want to do that. I'll stop doing that. And we do that, at the full moon ceremonies, or full moon gatherings, we talk about what we want to set aside. And often those of us that are doing them pretty regularly, often we'll find it's the same thing month after month, And then what I notice is that I'll get an insight about it, and I'll say, oh, okay, this is what I have to work on. It's the same thing basically, but it's looking at it from a different perspective. So I think that's what this chapter is talking about when and he comes to this Shohaku talks about it, and I don't know if it'll be clear, but I don't even know if I can find it. He ultimately says that's what it means to become the mountain. Just there's a good search on here. There's too many references. I don't think I can find it. Anyway, I guess I said what I need to say about that. Do you have anything you want to say?
As we're talking about letting go, I think I realized that well, I guess I haven't fully internalized. You're saying how like letting go is a process, and I feel like I haven't fully internalized that part of it because sometimes it's hard for me to recognize what letting go actually means or how to actually let go. Like sometimes letting go feels like just like recognizing a thought. Sometimes it feels like accepting something that I don't want to accept, but I just have to accept. And like, I think my brain is trying to be like, oh, like, here's how you let go. Like, if you feel that anxiety, I want to know the process for letting go. But it just sounds like there's no definition really. Like, it's sort of just like, you just do it at some point and you get better at it. Or so, I don't know. But,
yeah, I mean, I always say that right effort is just getting yourself to the cushion. Because it's amazing to me how this zazen practice of just sitting, shikantaza, actually allows us to see how our thoughts are working, and it's not something we can reason out or logic out, but we do notice those moments, we do have those moments where we kind of go, oh, wow, that's what I'm doing, and just noticing it is letting go. But we dismiss that experience of letting go because it's not something we can recognize with our mind. And Dogen talks about that too. He said that when we have this experience of, he doesn't call it letting go, he calls it Jiju Zanmai, kind of experiencing the everythingness of life, being in life rather than looking through our minds at life. And he said then, at that time, the grasses and walls and trees and fences, everything becomes the Dharma. But he said, and then he goes on to say in the same paragraph, really, but this is not something we can experience with the conscious mind. And so how do we get there? And one of my favorite things from the Bandowa, and it's right before he starts talking about Jiju Zanmai, he describes the practice as yuge. And the characters for you and ge, the you, according to Katagiri Roshi, means something like to play freely. And ge means, according to Katagiri Roshi, transformation through play. So I often describe Zazen as transformation through free play. And someone said, when I was talking about it one time, they said that sometimes it's described as like building a sand castle. You're just building it for the experience of building it. You know it's going to get washed away. But to kind of practice with that without some, just for the sake of doing it. And that, to me, that is a really beautiful description of how to approach kantaza. We're used to approaching everything by trying to figure out what the results are. But this is one of those experiences where you cannot see the results for a long time, and then you can only see them in retrospect. You can't see them at the time they're happening. But I always feel like what we do with everything that we experience is we immediately try to, we judge, was that a real experience or wasn't it? And so we can easily dismiss that experience of letting go as a non-experience because it doesn't fit into something that we understand. But after you've done it for a while, you start to realize, you start to say, oh, yeah. I mean, you start to find yourself talking about the experience itself, and then it becomes more real because it's more familiar. One of the things that Dogen says in here is the way to, let me see, the way to experience the mountains is to just prepare a meal, or to just eat, or to just wash the dishes, or to, it's everyday life. It's just to be completely one with whatever activity that we're doing. And I was talking to Liliane about that the other day because, we talk about taking a practice into whatever you're doing, like cooking. And when you're cooking for sashimi, you're kind of on a schedule. You've got to get the food out by a certain time. So there's this sort of, what time is it? Getting everything done, having it done, but how do you do that? By just, and Dogen talks about this in the Tenzo Kyokun. How do you do that? By just being with the food, by just being present with what you're doing, with every activity, with the chopping. And she said one time during a sesshin, she was really decided she wanted to do that. And she said she just lost track of time. And as it turned out, the meal was ready exactly at the right time. And I thought, I've thought so many times, I want to do that. When I go into the kitchen with that intention, I quickly lose that intention because it's so hard when you're on a schedule to not get kind of obsessed about it, So yeah, the practice itself is, it's the only way that that's the only thing that I can point to do. And then you get there and it's such a non-experience because shikantaza is not doing. And in fact, sometimes it becomes resisting the compulsion to do something. So I guess our time is up. So I guess we can finish up. May the merit of this practice benefit all beings and bring peace.
Pull up the announcements really quick. Okay. So next weekend, next Saturday, Dr. Hung Lai, who is the priest of Urban Dharma, will be speaking. And I think he's speaking about Wesak, which I think is also happening that same day at Urban Dharma. So it's like a Buddha Day celebration, and it's between Urban Dharma and Great Tree, and a lot of people show up. It's really fun. So that's May 10th, next Saturday. Next Saturday from 2 to 4 p.m. is the celebration. And then I think that's kind of it for the next week or so. And then also for people who are local, like we're still looking to set up volunteering for the mountain seat. So if you are interested, or if you have like friends who are interested, just have them send me an email at info@greattree.
And the thing at Urban Dharma, this is the one time during the year that all the Buddhists in town get together. So it's quite a nice. So now I'm gonna do 3 bows and so we're gonna hold 3 now for anyone. Okay, right? Okay, I'm gonna try to do it.